All good.
Welcome, welcome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar tonight. As you are entering, go ahead and write your name in the chat and where you are logging in from. We have a big group tonight, so we'd like to see where everyone is logging in from. It's nice that it's still light out and not dark, so I feel a little bit less exhausted, even though it was pitch black when I left this morning, but that's okay. Deerfield Beach, Cooper City. Hello, South Florida friends. Fort Lauderdale. Right, Team Edge, Indianapolis. Hey, Molly. Hope it's warmed up a little bit. And we've got Detroit.
South Dakota.
All right, South Dakota. Thanks for representing. We've got some of our colleagues headed up there for a conference next week. Massachusetts. Hey, Catherine. Another Michigan. Hey, Erica. Arizona.
All of our
We are
Edge
well,
family, thank you.
we are well represented tonight. Kansas, welcome, Kansas. Amanda, are you in our links grant? Hello from
Spring in Georgia.
Japan.
Welcome from Japan.
Glad to have you again. All right, I see a few more people trickling in, and then we will go ahead and get started. If you haven't said hello yet in the chat, please go ahead and do so. Hey, Jamie. All right. Well, I think we are going to go ahead and get started. And welcome to our webinar this evening. I think you are in for a treat. We have a nice big group tonight, so we encourage you to keep active in the chat and use that Q&A button for some questions. And we will have plenty of time at the end about things beyond Ellis Island. So thank you again for being here on behalf of Project Edge and the U.S. Department of Education. I would like to introduce our presenter for tonight. Dr. Sarah McNamara is an award-winning historian and associate professor of history at Texas A&M, where she serves as core faculty in the Latino Mexican American Studies program. She earned her PhD from UNC Chapel Hill, and her doctoral work helped her to launch her now published research focus, which is this book here on Ybor City, and many in this room have recently visited there. She's the author of Ybor City, Crucible of the Latina South, and she looks at the social, political, and labor histories of that community, and especially the role that immigrants played in shaping the neighborhood's identity across generations. She has earned the Sarah Whaley Book Prize from the National Women's Studies Association, which is very fitting for this month, and awards from the Southern Historical Association and the Southern Association for Women's Historian. She's very active still in things that go on in Florida, even though she is in Texas now. She also does quite a bit of work with historical markers and murals commemorating key episodes in Ybor's history. And I think most importantly, she is a brand new mom. So we are going to give her kudos for that as well. So I will pass it over to Sarah, and thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shauna. And thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar and for having me this evening. I'm excited to meet and speak with you. I come from a family of educators, and my mom was a K through 12 teacher who worked in Florida for over 30 years. So speaking and sharing histories of immigration, of the way that people understand themselves is really important to me because I always sit there and think about what I wish I knew when I was a student or the ways that we can enhance education that go beyond our basic training so that we not only make connections with students, but allow students to see themselves in the past they're telling. So, a few things before I get going. Number one, I just made my executive decision that I close the chat in here. So, Shauna, if you could let me know if there's a question midway, but I will leave questions towards the end. Um, in the interest of time, one thing that I have built into this presentation is I have a portion where we're going to be a bit interactive. But if there is something that I need to move past in order to stay on time, I'll put a pause on that activity and I will send you all the instructions via Shauna so that you all can implement it in your classroom if you wish, or use it as a template to apply in other forms. So, with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and dive into our lecture for this evening, Beyond Ellis Island, Immigration and Identity in the New South. So, the history of U.S. immigration, it is often centered around a story that looks at one particular narrative, right? Here's some image of children at Ellis Island around 1900. It's a story that many people purport to know, and it's one that centers immigration predominantly to urban centers that sit at the center of the idea of what the United States is, of urban centers that continue to define American life in specific ways. New York City, obviously, is one that comes to mind. Los Angeles, if we're thinking about migration to the US West, Chicago, but we don't oftentimes think about what this period of time meant for places that were below the Mason-Dixon line, right? Ideas and places that were defined by what we call the US South. Now, whenever I'm teaching and when I walk into a classroom, one of the things that I keep in mind is that if I begin with the thing that is most unfamiliar to the students in the classroom, it is overwhelming. And there's not a point of comparison, especially when thinking about how something that is different or can seem exceptional, how that fits into a national or even global context. So just like I would in my own classes, I'm starting right where we are moving beyond, right? At the turn of the 20th century, at the turn of between the 19th to the 20th century. And you have to excuse me, guys. I'm such a historian. When I hear the 80s, I think about the 1880s. So I will be specific. And if I ever confuse you, please just ask a question. Right. So when we imagine immigration, right, this period that is so defining, it is between the late 19th and early 20th century when there was such massive change in the United States. This is not just demographically in terms of numbers, but also in terms of who is coming to the United States. Prior to the late 19th century, right, the period after the Civil War, immigration to the United States had predominantly been defined by groups that were coming from the United Kingdom, from places that had been ideas of who was founding a place being consistent, right? So those ideas of what colonization or conquering the continent looked like in different forms, looking at those who were coming from Britain, Ireland, Scotland, and England, right, including here. Western Europe, right? So looking at France specifically, right? Histories of Spanish immigrants as well. But the Spanish immigrants came in smaller numbers prior to this period. But what we start to see is different during the late 19th century is who is coming. Who is coming begins to change massively. And with that changes not only the demographics of the United States, but what an American looks like and who is an American. And these are not things that are easily accepted. So the term that historians have used to describe this group of people are new immigrants. And new immigrants are those who are including the historic locations that I talked about. So Ireland, Scotland, Britain, France, but we're all Western Europe, but we're also thinking about Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Southeastern Europe, um, different forms of migration, smaller numbers coming from Latin America, or beginning to come from these different spaces. And the shift is notable. And the reactions to new people is not always welcoming. So to put a idea of what this meant, right? Between 1901 and 1914, 13 million immigrants came to the United States. Right? This is the largest shift and the largest influx of people who came to the United States in terms of a wave of immigration. During the 1890s, the shift in sorts of immigration, right, to these new immigrants meant that 3.5 million immigrants came during that decade alone, during the 1890s, seeking many times industrial jobs. They came from Southern and Eastern Europe, which meant that people with different cultures, religions, and languages, right, than those who had come previously. The new immigration that began to peak in the 1890s reached its pinnacle during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Between 1901 and 1914, right, as it says on this slide, 13 million immigrants came to the United States. Many Europeans, right, came through Ellis Island, but there were also those of Asian background, of Mexican newcomers, those who were Latinos who came to the U.S. West, as well as we're going to talk about, the U.S. South. Between 1900 and 1930, to keep these things in mind, 1 million Mexicans, over 10% of Mexico's population, came to the United States in part due to political unrest that was happening in the country. By 1900, in industrial cities, about 1/3 of the population were foreign born. And you all who were just in Ybor City, right, in these southern locations, sometimes that population outpaced this kind of a number. By the time you get to 1930, looking at the city of Tampa, you're nearing a 50% of the population is either foreign born or a combination of foreign born or US identifying Latino as being part of a generational process. Right? So by 1900 in these industrial cities, right, New York is one of these primary locations that we think of. And if we put this in terms that we can kind of understand, like looking at our neighbors and our neighborhoods, 4 out of 5 New Yorkers were foreign born in 1890 and tended to live in neighborhoods where people were nearby each other. So we think about what was the reaction in terms of identity of what this meant during this period of time. One of the things that begins to emerge in the United States is there is this surge of patriotism, this idea of defining what is American and what is not American. And there's different things that emerge during this period of time, like rituals or things that seem commonplace to us now. For example, right, rituals like the Pledge of Allegiance or standing to sing the national anthem. This emerged during this period of time. And it was done by groups of people, right? Especially those who had a sense of what does it mean to see the nation change? What does it mean to define who people are? And in a process, defining from the perspective of some what it is not. Right? The idea of a shifting nation and a shifting idea of what American was came to a head and with a sense of collision of finding new ways to assert a sense of nationhood. Another thing that emerged during this period of time is a concept of the second point that I'm hitting is nativism. So at times we even hear this word today and understanding what it is and its difference too in comparison to things like patriotism is really important, right? Especially when we think about our students in a class, right? People stand up. I remember standing up every day and saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Or if we are at sporting events, singing the national anthem, saying the Pledge of Allegiance in those contexts, why those things happen, they are as much a historical process as anything else. But patriotism is different than an idea of nativism. Nativism, right? I'm giving you all a definition here. Nativism is the belief of the importance of protecting, right? Of protecting and advocating for native born or established inhabitants against those of immigrants or against those of somebody who an individual defines is not like themselves, right? Is different from themselves. So things that we can associate with nativism is that things like cultural difference confirmed assumptions of superiority, right? The idea that somebody looks different, right, than a newcomer moving into a neighborhood looks different or speaks a different language. than somebody who had been living there long term. The idea that the person who had been there prior has a sense of superiority or has a sense of belonging that somebody inherently doesn't have. There were other things that were a part of this that became elements of national conversations. So things like illiteracy or lack of English language abilities made were elements that emerged in nativist arguments of what it meant to be inherently lesser than. Another thing was religious difference, religious prejudice, especially against Catholics and Jews, was at a height during this period, and it fostered anti immigrant sentiment. And from these things, there were different elements that emerged that both created conversation as well as propaganda and that worked to shape how people thought or understood themselves, as well as how people understood these new immigrants during the period. There was one group of people, right, called the American, or one organization called the American Protective Association, the American Protective Association, or the APA. The American Protective Association promoted restrictions on immigrants and it urged employers not to employ Catholics and prompted the teaching of what they called the American language within schools. Right. So here's um, two cartoons from this period of time that are talking about what is happening in the United States, especially in terms of religious difference and the ways that it is being talked about in schools, right? So if we look at the image on the left, which I'm hoping is your left, the one with the tent, right? So there is an American flag that is the tent, the idea of propaganda on the outside, and that those who are Catholic are coming for the conversations or to control and infiltrate American public schools, which is in the background. On the right hand side, you have the idea of the Catholic Church acting as an octopus, right, with each of its arms reaching into different areas of American life. Right. So one of the great things about using images like this in a classroom is that it gives students an eye into or a lens into what were people looking at during this period of time and how is that informing them. And as I'm even sitting here thinking, I would probably talk about it in terms of like modern day memes or things that they're scrolling through on Instagram, or I guess for students, TikTok. I'm aging myself right now, the one area where I'm not online. So in addition to things like the American Protective Association, there was also things like the Immigration Restriction League. The Immigration Restriction League, it was founded in 1894, and it worked to, as it said, protect Americans from Southern and Eastern European immigrants believed to be inferior to Anglo-Saxons. Right, so Anglo-Saxons being those of Anglican descent, so from England, Ireland, from the UK region. Right, so Immigration Restriction League, it founded in 1894. It tried to bar anybody who was illiterate, which is also important to keep in mind that the majority of the US population during this period of time was likewise illiterate. It was dedicated to saving what it called the Anglo-Saxon race from being, as they said, contaminated or overrun. And this was a measure adopted in 1897 by US legislature, but it was vetoed by President Grover Cleveland during this period of time. Again, another image over here to the right to consider or to think about how we create conversations out of this. There is, right, Uncle Sam standing at the gates holding his nose while there is a person who is representing an immigrant from these regions holding baggage, right? Holding baggage that is associated with immigration during this period of time. So there's anarchism in the back, right? There are things like desegregation, right? That's carrying on his back, disease, poverty, right? These negative associations during this period of time with Eastern and Southern European immigrants. Right. And finally, another thing that emerged was a call for Americanization, right? The adoption of American standards. One example is Henry Ford, who put forth such a he was an advocate. He was definitely an anti-Semite, had his own newspaper and talked about and wrote openly about the issues with what he believed were issues with Jewish immigrants coming to the United States. The way that he put it, during this period, I'm sorry about that, was that there's nothing that the international Jew fears so much as the truth or any hint of the truth about himself. And so, what the Ford Motor Company sociological department did is that it fired workers who didn't adapt to what they defined as an American standard. Right. So, these things are really important to remember that they not only undergirded the things like laws, which we are about to talk about, but they were a part of open conversation. They were a part of open conversation that defined how people living in the United States understood immigration, the types of association that they had with immigrants. And it counters our idea that people arrived in the United States with open arms, that this idea of a melting pot is something that is as simple as people melding together. There is much give and there's much take, and there is conflict. That's a part of what does it mean to redefine a nation, especially as a nation is reemerging, it's expanding, it's changing its idea of an economy. And immigrant labor, immigrant work, immigrant ideas were important to that as well. Right. So, not just the cultural components of how people understood, but remembering the essential nature and the essential components that these people played. So, alongside these ideas were legal restrictions. And we begin to see legal restrictions emerge during the late 19th century, and it actually continues well through the 20th century as laws emerge and redefine in relationship to different periods of time. So, one of the most notorious acts that people point to, especially because they are among the first, is the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? It first emerged in 1882 and it became permanent in 1902. This was federal law that prohibited the immigration of Chinese laborers, and it likewise allowed for the deportation without due process of law. Right? The idea of due process is really important because whether somebody is a US citizen or not, according to the US Constitution, everybody is entitled to due process before a court of law. Right? So in this image, again, a great way to think about it in terms of looking at a propaganda that was prevalent during that time, looking at pictures that were in newspapers and in magazines, have one to the right. Another act that emerged, an example of immigration restriction, was the 1917 Immigration Act. So this required that all immigrants over 16 were required to pass literacy tests. It increased taxes that immigrants paid upon arrival to the United States, and it excluded immigration from all who were in Asian nations except for the Philippines and Japan. The reason for the exclusion of the Philippines and Japan, if we think about this, is the Philippines, right? They had a different relationship with the United States following the end of what's known in the United States as the Spanish American War, where the United States had a colonial relationship with the Philippines during this time, as well as with Japan, it was a bit different. What it was called a gentleman's agreement between the two nations is what led to this limitation. So Japan and the United States having an agreement where visas and things would not be issued, but that the nation of Japan itself would discourage immigration to the United States. And as a result, it would not be part of the 1917 Immigration Act. The last example that I'm going to give you all here is the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921, it's legislation that was it was utilized to look at immigration statistics of a maximum number of immigrants allowed to enter the United States from each nation, right? From each nation that had been coming to the US and its region. The numbers were skewed to favor immigration from Western European nations while severely curbing immigration from other areas perceived to be undesirable. Now, the way that the Emergency Quota Act was created is that it was based on the census in the late 19th century, a late 19th century census. So one that occurred prior to the influx of immigration to the United States. Right. So when it says the cutoff of 3%, it's favoring certain nations and limiting others, immigrants from other places. Right. So when we think about all this, right, I'm going to send you all an example of the critical thinking activity that I would do in a classroom. This is something that I've done in classes with hundreds of people, but a model like this is equally effective in smaller classes. But when we're thinking about K through 12 students, I would also think in terms of social media and forms of engagement that they use themselves. So after showing or speaking to students about these kinds of histories, I would ask them to look at political cartoons, or you may even grab them, as I said, from social media right now. Ask them to think about the arguments that are made, the attitudes that are a part of the cartoonists, and the solutions, if any of them propose them. And so going through here, the puck is it's a gold mine, especially to use in a classroom, as are things like Lewis Hine photographs. And if you are in a particular location where there is a strong history of immigration, pulling from local archives is also fantastic. And so here's an example of one, of another, right here. And finally, the last, right, one that I use for you all, right, pulled through Getty. I then give the students all three together, bring the prompt forward one more time, and ask us to openly discuss. We're not going to have enough time right now to do this together because I want to make sure that we get to the heart of all of this, looking at things within the New South and the different portions of identity, but having a big idea of the constraints and the environment under which regional histories and state histories happen is really important to explain to students. Because without those elements, without those touchstones, students are going to have a hard time placing into context why the local matters. But if you do set that stage, they will be able to iterate those ideas, to think of themselves not just as people who have a particular history that is narrow or that is specific, but one that expands and that reaches out as part of a national story that they too are a part of. All right, next, and at the heart of this, rethinking the narrative of immigration in the New South. All right, so when we're thinking about the narrative of immigration in the New South, one thing that comes to mind is that it's important that we define what the New South is. So the New South is a term that describes the post-bellum U.S. South, or the post-Civil War South, in the period which sought to modernize the region by transitioning from an agrarian economy fueled by the labor of enslaved people to an industrial, diversified economy. The concept of the New South, it aimed to adopt northern, so U.S. northern styles of manufacturing, to expand railroads, and to think about urban growth while enforcing white supremacy through Jim Crow laws. So thinking about the New South, right, it's bringing about this tension that what does it mean to modernize, while at the same time thinking of preserving different elements that had defined the region for many years. And just in case, right, we haven't thought about this, explaining things like Jim Crow is really hard to students, but making sure that you are defining it takes it out of the context, especially when we think about what does it mean for a student to take something personally rather than thinking of it as a historical experience is to define it. So within here, I'm giving you all a definition as well. And so Jim Crow. Jim Crow was the name of the racial caste system, which operated primarily, but not exclusively, in the southern and border states, right, in this region, right, this southern region of the US South between 1877 and the mid 1960s. Jim Crow, it was more than a set of laws. It was also an oppressive culture that connected to the idea of white racial superiority. And one of the things when I'm explaining to students that I didn't include in here is even explaining the origin of the word Jim Crow. It helps students make an association. Jim Crow was a minstrel character that was intended, that was played by those who were white Southerners who would darken their skin to imitate what it meant to be somebody who was African American in the South. And that is where the term Jim Crow law comes from. So there were different forms of the ways that this worked, both through de facto segregation and through de jure segregation. So de facto segregation, it's a Latin phrase meaning in fact. And in terms of segregation, it applies to the cultural or societal pressure to segregate, right? So these are things, as I say to students, that were in practice, but not by law, right? So the idea of who somebody could sit next to when it wasn't legislated, but that it was uncomfortable. The idea of shaking a person's hand who looked different than somebody else or who was defined as racially different, of that being a de facto form of segregation. Um, Different forms of segregation being enforced by terror. I have an image of the Ku Klux Klan here. That would be an example of de facto segregation, right? And here's another of Japanese Americans being unwelcome in what is being defined as a white man's neighborhood. This wouldn't have necessarily been a legal form, but making clear who belongs here and who doesn't in these different spaces. The other, de jure, is a Latin phrase meaning by law. By law, we are very familiar with these things, right? The definitions of who could go in different public spaces, those were Jim Crow laws. Who could marry whom? These are Jim Crow laws. Who went to which kind of school? Those are forms of de jure segregation. Now, when we're thinking about why these concepts are important to immigration, it's because the way that immigrants experience different locations and the ways that they experience the United States was in reference to the ways that these different areas were governed. It created hierarchies in terms of how people understood themselves, as well as how they sought to belong in different locations. The way that I oftentimes say it when I'm talking to my students is that the experience of migration is that location and place matter and migration patterns matter. And what I mean by that is when somebody enters any new location, right? Somebody immigrates to a different place. It's not just their experience of coming from a particular nation that matters and coming into another. It's also the context that they immigrate into. So somebody who is immigrating from Italy to New Orleans is going to have a different experience than somebody who is immigrating from Italy to New York City because the two locations operate differently. Likewise, somebody who is coming from Italy to Tampa, Florida, we'll talk about that in a second, is going to have a different experience. This not only, as I said, migration patterns matter as well, because when we think about there's so many from Florida, because I know we're Florida based in this, it's also a reason why politics and people are different when we think about migration waves, who is going where. If we think about the turn of the 20th century and Cubans who came from the island to Tampa, Florida, who had a particular political experience, they tended to be ardently leftist. They tended to leave with the hope of creating a sense of independence, as well as immigrating to work in a specific type of labor, the Cuban cigar industry. That's different than what happened during the 1960s and what comes to define Miami, right? So the two locations have different groups of people who understand themselves differently, not even though there is a shared national heritage. Even though there's things that bring people together, the sense of identity in location to place can be different. So when we're thinking about this, I want us to consider a few different sites when we are thinking about immigration in the New South. And in this, I want to talk about a few areas. I'm going to talk about Texas, New Orleans, Louisiana, Key West, Florida, and Ybor City, Florida. So Texas. Immigration to Texas during this period, right, that of the New South and from the late 19th century, right, through mid-century, we're looking at a majority of people who are coming who are German, a high level of German immigration, and a high level of Mexican immigration, right, because Texas is a border state. German immigration, I have a picture of German immigrants here, came to work predominantly in things like came to work in the cattle industry. Some became merchants in the cotton industry, and came to own land in different forms. Those who were of Mexican descent came to Texas as right fleeing political unrest that was happening in Mexico, right in their homeland. And when we're thinking about Mexican immigration, especially thinking about Texas and the broader Southwest, it's really important to remember that not too long ago, right, we're thinking about the turn of the 20th century, the region that was Texas was indeed Mexico. And prior to that, this region was a part of the expanding, right, of expanding region where Spain had colonized, right, the North American continent. So there is this saying from different theorists who discuss the way to frame this is that people not necessarily coming, but the border crossing an area that had been a historic homeland, right? We didn't cross the border, but the border crossed us. And that this defines this group's relationship to a historic homeland and to what is today Texas. Right. So there is an influx and a shift in who is living in this region and what this looks like. And it also redefines economy. Another being New Orleans, Louisiana. Italians, specifically Sicilians, right? Specifically Sicilians are the largest group who are coming during this period. But there's also, just like in other areas of the United States, a large influx of people who are Eastern European. And lesser known, there is a there is a history of Filipinos coming to Louisiana, specifically working in the Bayou regions. So while the others are focusing on New Orleans, we're thinking more broadly in terms of where Filipinos were living and working together. There is a great new book that's mostly looking at post Katrina New Orleans by a historian named Sarah Fouts that is examining different foodways, and Filipinos play a role, as do other migrant groups. And I highly recommend taking a look at it. I'm very excited for this book. So there's economic drivers here at play as well, looking at agricultural labor as well as business and merchant work and shipping, right? Because New Orleans is a major port. Some people come to stay, some people come to continue shipping and moving goods out. And finally, right, thinking about this period of time, and since I know that so many of you have taken a field trip there, and obviously the topic is near and dear to my heart as a native Floridian, as a person who is of my family is from Ybor City. They were Cuban cigar workers, looking at Key West, Florida and Ybor City, Florida. So Key West and Ybor City, they share a history in terms of migration, where Cuban migration was the predominant population, right? Cuban American migration was predominant. Cuban migration to Florida was predominant in both of these locations. Over here, I have a map that is showing the pathways that people took, especially by using the plant system, right? So going from Havana, people could enter either directly, right, through different regions up to Tampa, but the most frequently used was to go from Havana to Key West to change lines and then to continue onward. Right, so Key West emerged as a location of Cuban migration earliest. And it emerged during the Cuban Wars for Independence when the Cuban cigar industry began relocating from the island to Key West in order to have a sense of economic stability in this that was not possible on the island during wartime. So while the Cuban cigar industry relocated, one of the things that manufacturers experienced was that while the workforce came with it, people moved back and forth. And Cuban cigar work was really unique because those who were a part of it were incredibly politically active. There were different cultural components that were a portion of the work that left people dedicated to a sense of creating a Cuba for Cubans. So so when we're thinking about Key West was exciting and volatile and all these different things connected to labor, right? So there would be factories that were blown up. There was one, some were caught afire. Sometimes there would be no workforces. Labor unionism was incredibly strong, and it was a part of this cross national labor network. In an effort to stabilize the Cuban cigar industry, there's one cigar manufacturer um, who moves to Tampa, Florida, specifically Ybor City. It names it after himself. Vicente Martinez Ybor is the founder, and he buys a tract of land, partners with another cigar manufacturer, and creates Ybor City. His idea is very much mimicking what I introduced at the beginning of this talk, that the idea was to create and to mimic a form of migration, a form of industrialization that mimicked the U.S. North. So Ybor City very much becomes a an industrial city that is a place intended to control workers, the thing that was not possible in Key West. So in thinking about this, right, just as on the slide, I noted, although I did not say, right, there are Cubans, there's Sicilians, there's Spaniards, and there's a small population of Germans, specifically those who are Jewish, who collide in this place. And this is a picture that I know a lot of people are from Miami on here, and that Tampa and Miami can go to war at of what a Cuban sandwich is. But the idea, whether it's reality or whether it's lore that lives in Tampa, is that every element has a component of a Cuban sandwich as it serves in Tampa, has an element of the immigrants who formed this place, right? So there's the Cuban bread, there's the German yellow mustard, there are the pickles, the Jewish pickles, there's the Swiss cheese, the Genoa salami, noting Sicilians are Italians, and then the Cuban roasted pork and the ham nodding towards Spaniards, right? So the way that people talk about it, again, probably much more lore than reality, but that it is a food that it is a product of the migration that defines this place. Right, so Ybor City, as I said, and Key West, they were defined by the Cuban cigar industry. And here's a picture from Key West of these early cigar factories. And what is really cool about this image is that it breaks down what each floor of a cigar factory looked like. So if you're giving students an idea of what it meant to do work or what it meant to be a part of work, this is a great image, right? It breaks it down from those who were making filler to an inspection room, to cigar makers, to tobacco strippers, those who removed the stem from the center of the leaf. To give people a different idea of who did what kinds of work. And you can also analyze who's in each picture. Like if you look at the tobacco strippers, also known as desvaliadoras, these were predominantly women. They were paid the least amount of money in terms of this kind of work. Right? Here's another image. This is of cigar workers in Ybor City. There is a Lewis Hines photo from the Library of Congress up here in the upper right, as well as images from local archives in Ybor City, right down here, one in the center and one up, that is showing the image of a lector. A lector was a person who read to the readers during their day of work and kept them informed of both local as well as national and international news. A lector was not paid by their employer, it was paid by the workers themselves. So they answered to the workers, which meant that if somebody didn't like a lector, or they were not performing their utmost, or they were not delivering what people wanted, they could be fired. The picture down in the center is a picture of cigar work after the 1930s, when it became predominantly women's work as the industry changed. Here's an image, right, if we're thinking about what this looks like. And just as we were talking about New York City, Ybor City, the emergence of the Cuban cigar industry led to the population of Tampa tripling by 1900 and continuing to skyrocket thereafter. looking at this image, you see different forms of infrastructure that were a part of this. You see the row houses, the company housing in the background. You see larger houses, right, perhaps owned by those who owned factories, which were mostly Spaniards, as well as different forms of city infrastructure that were necessary as both industry expanded and as places boomed. Here's a closer up photo of what that housing looked like. And thinking about the ideas of culture, right, that continued to live, um, there were different mutual aid societies, and people had dances. Here's a picture of kids who are attending a dance at the Cuban Club in 1912, as well as cultures of labor that continued to emerge. The building on the right-hand side still remains, and this was the Labor Temple or the Centro Obrero. And over here on the left-hand side is a picture of people congregating, all of whom were parts of labor unions in the midst of a general strike that brought the industry to its knees. So one of the things that's important to remember is that while Ybor City emerged as a place of control, that wasn't necessarily successful. Ideas of unionism and of labor organization, it thrived in Ybor City, and it lived through different forms of communication like individual newspapers right here. La Traducción is, or it translates to the translation, was a newspaper that existed to translate news from across the globe, as well as had local coverage. And La Gaceta, which continues to exist today, it is the only trilingual newspaper in the United States, and it is still owned by the original family. The founder of this newspaper, his name was Victoriano Mantega. He was once a lector himself. So when he left the profession of being a lector, he emerged as the community or the neighborhood lector through the newspaper. But one of the things about all these locations, and when we're thinking about Ybor City, is that it was also a place of international collisions, right? So there were people whose ideas came and also expanded in these different locations. So on the left-hand side is a picture of a woman named Luisa Capetillo, who was a labor organizer from Puerto Rico. And on the right-hand side, Luisa Moreno, who was the first woman who became a labor organizer through the American Federation of Labor. And she organized cigar workers in Ybor City. Luisa Capetillo, again, on the left-hand side, she wrote the first feminist treatise. So the first idea of what feminism was coming out of the island. Right. So these ideas, they lived not just among people, not just in the streets, but also in the factory. Here's another image of a lector who was elevated, as well as workers listening during their workday. And they lived all as well within mutual aid societies that became the cultural cornerstones of what it meant to live here. Right. There were opera houses and there were forms of education, as well as gyms, right, for people to work out, or even what are they called? Gosh, guys, I'm having a moment. It'll come to me. Bowling alleys that were in the basements, right? And all of these things, they were built with money and donations and membership dues of people who lived in this space. But one of the important things that I talked about is just as the reaction to people is that the ideas that determined the South also were accepted and were a part of immigrants figuring out who they were. Right here, you're looking at a picture of people who are congregating for a dance at La Sociedad Martí Maceo, which is not one of the original mutual aid societies, but it's one that emerged when Ybor City became a part of the city of Tampa and a part of Hillsborough County. And it was told, or those who lived there and community leaders were told, that they had to follow rules of segregation. And there is a meeting with very few minutes where the Cuban Club disassociated. And what it did is that it removed all members who were Black. And what emerged in its place was La Sociedad Martí Maceo, which became the Afro-Cuban Club. For those of you all who went to Ybor City, the Sociedad Martí Maceo was on 7th Avenue, but it is not the original. The Sociedad Martí Maceo is the only mutual aid society that was torn down during urban renewal. And so these are the different elements that were a part of it, but they also define people's political culture. This is a picture of Fidel Castro, who came and lived in Ybor City for a period of months during the 1950s in an effort to fundraise for the revolution. There were people who were staunch supporters of Castro who lived in Ybor City, and they believed that he could bring the idea of an independent Cuba, as well as, perfect. Thank you so much, Shauna. But one of the realities that Castro found when he came to Ybor is that it was a people who had a sense of what it meant to belong at a particular location. And the politics that they were a part of was much more about living and thriving and finding a place for oneself in the United States more so than redefining Cuba as their grandparents had done. And finally, here's a picture. The young woman in this picture, she is alive and well today. Her name is Marlene Maceda. But following ideas of political involvement, those in Ybor City became who were a part of these progressive movements, right? Who were part of labor organizing, who became a part of different forms of advocacy in the 1930s, who identified with unionism and organization in different ways, also became members of progressive political parties. And so the Viva Kennedy clubs, they thrived, as well as he came to visit Tampa in the midst of organizing just a few days prior to him being assassinated in Texas. And so when we're thinking about this with students, the last thing that I'll say in the final few minutes that I have is that I encourage everybody to allow students to think about the personal elements of what history is. So the personal elements of how immigration is personal, how the history that surrounds them is personal, and asking them to triangulate that in their own lives. Because even as I'm sitting here telling this story to you, I wouldn't have the job that I had if there hadn't been somebody who asked me about myself and my own position to the past that is a part of us. So I'm showing you right here, this is a clipping. And I tell this story in my book. It's the story that opens my book, actually. This is a clipping from a newspaper, and the original photograph was taken in 1937. But this picture ran in what was then the Tampa Bay Tampa Tribune in the early 1990s. The handwriting on this is that of my grandmother, and she's indicating the women in my family who were cigar workers and were a part of this event. She outlined Abuela Amelia, and then she noted my Aunt Margot. As I write about, and one of the things that's important, I think, to also think about as educators, is my grandmother never told me the context of what any of this was. I remember she showing this to me when I was 16, and I could tell that these women did something that was important and that she was proud of, but I didn't know why. And it took me being a historian to understand the significance of this event. And right here, all those elements that we talk about in the New South are coming together. On this day in 1937, there were more than 7,000 women who marched through the streets of Ybor City, from Ybor to the front steps of City Hall. And what they were demanding is that the United States and the mayor of Tampa and the governor of Florida take a stance on the Spanish Civil War and on anti-fascism. And what they were demanding as well is that those in their community who had, during the Great Depression, lost their jobs in mass, particularly men, have equal access to things like WPA assistance, have equal access to things like jobs, because all of those elements of who belonged and who didn't meant that within Ybor City, people thrived. But beyond it, they met a series of different conflicts of what it meant to be excluded. And my grandmother, right, who was born in the 1930s, came of age in the 1940s, had this visceral love of the United States, but also this visceral sense of wanting to belong and never quite feeling like she did. And those were the things that she couldn't say to me. But those are the things that when you start looking, that you begin to find those ideas. From this, right, I began the Nuestras Historias project, and I worked with a group of students at Texas A&M. There's a historical marker about this event on 7th Avenue, and my students worked with me as well as a Cuban American artist from Ybor City to create this image. And today it is on 7th Avenue if you were walking toward the Columbia restaurant. So when we think about why these histories matter, There are those meta ideas of migration, of people coming from all these different locations. There are those ideas of laws, but there's also the sense of how this is a part of the fabric that makes the story of every kid that sits in your classroom. And if we ask them to think about it from a personal perspective, it's not just a story of what makes a nation, it's also the story of what makes a person. And this is my grandma walking in her backyard in Ybor City during the 1940s. Thank you all.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for sharing so many of your personal family images with us. Those are super powerful. We do
Thank
have
you
about
guys.
5 minutes for questions.
I am so
So
sorry, everyone. I'm long winded. I told Shauna about this in advance. I was like, I'm going to do 30 minutes. And here we are. I'm so
well, we have some time. So the
okay.
first question is, could you share where you found the American Protective Association cartoons and if those are available online?
They're definitely available online. Can I send that information to Shauna and I will kind of have a resource log for you all? That has been a part of my lecture, I think, since like 2016. It's been a while. So I will go back and find it. I probably pulled it from the Library of Congress. That's where the majority of my images are from.
Okay, your favorite Cuban restaurant in Tampa? That was
Oh
a
my
question.
gosh. Oh, I feel like I'm going to get in trouble. Um, my favorite is Arco Iris, if I'm going to be honest. It's a small restaurant that is in this area called West Tampa, and it's family owned. It has terrible parking, but the food is really great. And I mean, I would highly recommend it to anybody who go there. But there's others that are great as well.
All
The
right, Brooke
Columbia is
is,
fancy.
we did go to the Columbia. Brooke
Yeah.
is asking if you could go back to the slide that has the questions when looking at political cartoons for students.
I can, but I also have this as a worksheet. I can send that to Shauna for you all to use in your own classrooms as
That would
well.
be great.
The
That would be
this type of activity, it can be translated to any, I would say any grouping of images that I had in this, but also images that you all have that you use oftentimes. So thinking about three, I do a lot of think, pair, share. But this type of an activity, I am able to get students talking and debating if it's a class of 150 of 300 students in the same way that I can in a class of 20. So it really works effectively to have this type um, of an activity in a classroom.
great. Great. Audrey asks, did your research indicate that the Cuban agricultural industry segregated and have Black Cubans working in the fields, growing tobacco and sugar, but not in the manufacturing sector of these industries, and therefore not able to migrate for the cigar industry?
So one of the things that's pretty different when we're looking at the histories of Miami versus Tampa is that Tampa did have a sizable Afro-Cuban community. Afro-Cubans worked in the Cuban cigar industry in different positions. If you look at early images, which I can also supply some of these, if you look at a cigar, the cigar rolling floor, there are Afro-Cubans alongside those who are of lighter complexions, who are working in the industry. However, the majority were mojadores, so those who were working at the basement floor and making sure that the tobacco stayed moist. This was the least skilled and also the lowest paid, lower than the despedidoras. I do talk about in my book the who is doing the labor of harvesting tobacco, and that is a portion of that story as well. And one of the things to, of course, remember is that one of the things that's happening in the background of all of this, because we think about things as being so long ago, is the history of slavery on the island, right? We think about it as uniquely American, but it was also a major driver of the Cuban economy in terms of its agricultural past and things like sugar, things like tobacco, right? This was done by Afro-Cuban labor, and Cuba had a process of what's called indemnified into slavery, which meant that it happened progressively, slowly over time, but that there are elements of this.
All right. Any other questions that we can answer? I don't know if you'd be willing to share your PowerPoint, Sarah, so that teachers can pull some of the images out of there. I can put that in their
Yeah,
Canvas
absolutely.
groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people
Okay.
want to, oh, I see Audrey. I have more photos of Afro-Cubans if you'd like them. And there are a ton also available through the University of South Florida. The Afro-Cuban Club has donated its files there. And those are a part of that as well.
All right. Well, great. Any other questions we can answer before we log off? Any last questions? I love the activities that you shared. I love that you personalized it for what we could use in K-12. That was really fantastic. And it was a great perspective, aside from Ellis Island, to look at immigration with a little bit of a different lens. So thank you so much. If you
Thank you,
are
Shauna.
part of the Edge group, we are heading to our debrief after party. You should have received an email. I'm going to put that in the chat as well. So you can get there. The password for that is Edge if you are part of Team Edge and you are attending that. Otherwise, everyone else is free to go. Thank you so much for joining us. But before we head out, a couple more webinars you can register for. Declaration to Statehood, how Slovakia claims sovereignty. That's on the 14th. That's at 11 in the morning, but we will record it. Our European friends are running that, so that's why that's a little bit earlier. April 9th, Wilderness Road and Appalachia in the 20th century. We have the Right Question Institute on April 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern, doing their questioning techniques. And then an evening with the American Philosophical Society on April 28th at 7 Eastern. So thanks again for joining us. And I hope everyone has a great night. Thanks all.